Summer is upon us. Do you want to stay cool and dry at night? Try bamboo sheets from CozyEarth.com. Not only do you get a good night's sleep and stay cool and dry, but also you get to save 21% off just by using our code at checkout. InfoGo. And they have a 100-night sleep trial, so it's a win-win. If you don't like them, send them back, but I promise you'll fall in love with them. And while you're over there, check out their socks. They have a whole line of apparel. And that's CozyEarth.com. Use our code InfoGo at checkout to save 21% off. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William,
And I'm Kat,
and that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity wherever you go.
So currently it's all in the news, the Hantavirus. And we kind of wanted to know where it came from. Is it new? What happened? Like, do our docu-style podcast that we do here. And so the mystery of the Hantavirus.
Imagine opening an old shed that hasn't been touched in months. Maybe it's a hunting cabin sealed through the winter, sitting alone beneath dry desert skies. The door groans as it swings open. Sunlight slips through the cracks in the wood, cutting bright beams through the darkness. Now, dust hangs suspended in the air, drifting slowly like smoke in still water. The building smells dry, stale, forgotten. Somewhere in the silence, a broom scrapes across old floorboards.
And with that single motion, something invisible rises to the air. Not poison gas, not chemicals, not anything dramatic enough to trigger alarm bells right away. Just microscopic particles mixed into dust. Tiny fragments from rodent droppings and urine that dried unnoticed in corners, beneath shelves, into walls. Particles so small they can float through the air for hours without being seen.
And a person breathes them in without realizing it. Yeah, at first, nothing seems unusual. Days pass. Then comes the fatigue. Fever follows. Muscles ache deeply, especially in the back and legs. The symptoms resemble influenza so closely that most people would never suspect anything unusual. In the early stages of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, patients often appear to have a routine viral illness headaches, chills, nausea, exhaustion, nothing that immediately suggests a deadly infection.
But then the illness, it starts to change. The coughing starts. Breathing becomes difficult. The chest feels tight, heavy, almost mechanical, as though the lungs are struggling against an invisible weight. Oxygen levels began dropping rapidly. Patients who were walking and talking earlier in the day well, they can deteriorate within hours. Many require emergency hospitalization. Some are placed on ventilators as doctors fight to keep oxygen moving through lungs that are beginning to be filled with liquid.
Now, what makes hantavirus especially terrifying is how ordinary the exposure can be. There's no dramatic encounter, no obvious wound, no warning sign. The danger exists in routine places people rarely think twice about garages, barns, crawl spaces, storage sheds, cabins closed for the winter. The threat is quiet, microscopic, and almost completely invisible.
That reality became horrifyingly clear in 1993. In the Four Corners region of American Southwest, where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet, healthy young adults began collapsing from a mysterious respiratory illness. Many were in their 20s and 30s. Some died within days of their first symptoms. Doctors, well, they were stunned by the speed of the disease and confused by what they were seeing. Patients arrived with flu like symptoms, only to spiral rapidly into severe respiratory failure. Their lungs filled with liquid, oxygen levels crashed, and despite intensive care, many could not be saved.
And no one knew what was causing it. There seemed to be no obvious connection between victims. No contaminated food source, no toxic spill, no known disease that matched the pattern unfolding across the Southwest. Fear spread almost as quickly as the illness itself, and This is the story of one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern America, Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome.
So the outbreak began in one of the most isolated regions in the US, the Four Corners. This is the area where, as we talked about, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all meet on a single geographic point. A landscape defined by wide deserts, towering mesas, deep canyons, and enormous stretches of open land. Roads can run for miles, and when we say miles, we mean miles without passing another human being on the planet. Small towns are scattered between rock formations and dry plains connected by long highways that cut through, well, silence, just pure, eerie silence on a desolate road.
But you mean you see a pretty view of mountains, unless you're in the desert area and then it's sagebrush and then mountains.
I guess the view is beautiful. It's just eerie though, because 90% of the time you just feel alone.
I don't know. I love it out there. I miss the West. So the region is visually stunning, but also very unforgiving. Summers bring intense heat, winters can turn bitterly cold. Wind pushes sand across empty roads and maybe some tumbleweeds. And storms can appear suddenly over the desert horizon. Many homes sit far from major cities or hospitals. Old barns lean against the wind, and trailers rest on isolated patches of land. Cabins and sheds stand weathered by years of sun and dust, and in many places, rodents are simply a part of daily life, unless you have cats. Mice slipping through the walls or appearing in storage buildings or are common enough, but people barely notice them.
Unless you have active cats. There are lazy cats that are like,
There are insanely lazy cats.
yeah.
I have to worry about lizards.
Now, if you got an active cat, great. If you got a lazy cat, maybe.
Maybe not so great.
Did you
They
know
might
some?
become friends.
Yeah, basically. What was it, Garfield?
Yeah.
So much of the outbreak centered around areas connected to the Navajo Nation, where reservations spans parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Communities there often face limited infrastructure and reduced access to healthcare facilities. Especially in the early 1990s, some families lived hours from advanced medical centers. Small local clinics could, well, they could treat common illnesses, but a fast-moving respiratory emergency required resources that, well, just wasn't always nearby. And distance mattered. When patients suddenly began struggling to breathe, valuable time could just disappear on long drives across isolated highways.
The remoteness of the region also made the outbreak feel more unsettling. In crowded cities, people expect disease outbreaks to spread through density and movement, but the Four Corners felt different. The communities were small, spread apart, quiet, and cases appeared in places surrounded not by crowds, but by empty land and silence. That isolation amplified the mystery. Healthy young adults were becoming critically ill in towns that seemed disconnected from one another, separated by desert, distance, and miles of open terrain.
And there was another psychological factor at work here. The landscape itself carried a sense of exposure. The desert can feel ancient and indifferent, beautiful but harsh, a place where nature still dominates daily life. In environments like that, danger often comes quietly. Heat, dehydration, storms, isolation. Hantavirus would join that list, not as a predator people could see, but as something hidden inside ordinary spaces, beneath floorboards, inside sheds, behind old walls, just waiting in unnoticed in the dust.
At first, the outbreak did not look like the beginning of a medical mystery. It looked like the flu. The people getting sick were not elderly patients or individuals with weakened immune systems. Many were young, healthy adults in their 20s and 30s. Some were active, working full time jobs, spending time outdoors, raising families, or traveling across the Southwest. Nothing about them suggested they were at high risk for sudden respiratory collapse. That normalcy made what happened next far more disturbing.
So the illness usually began quietly. Patients develop fever, headaches, chills, nausea, and deep muscle pain, especially in the legs and lower back. The symptoms closely resembled, well, influenza, or other common viral infections. In the early stages, most doctors had little reason to panic. A patient with a fever and body aches during the cold and flu season, well, it was routine. Rest, fluids, observation. At first, there was nothing obviously unique about the cases, but then the illness changed with terrifying speed.
Within just a few days, patients who initially seemed stable began coughing heavily and struggling to breathe. Their oxygen levels dropped rapidly. Some described a crushing sensation in the chest, as though they could not pull in enough air. Now, inside the lungs, fluid began accumulating or building up, making breathing progressively more difficult. Doctors watched otherwise healthy people deteriorate within hours. Patients who walked into hospitals under their own power sometimes ended up in intensive care before the day was over.
One of the earliest and most important cases involved a young Navajo couple that were traveling through New Mexico in the spring of 1993. The woman had already died after developing sudden respiratory symptoms that, well, doctors at the time they just couldn't explain. Shortly afterward, her fiance also became seriously ill. While driving to seek medical help, his condition worsened dramatically, and he died rapidly just days after his first symptoms appeared.
The deaths shocked local healthcare workers because the victims did not fit expected patterns for severe respiratory disease. They were young, previously healthy, and now two people closely connected to one another had died from the same mysterious illness. That case became one of the first major clues investigators could follow.
Until then, the illness seemed scattered and disconnected, appearing in isolated communities across the Southwest with no obvious explanation, right? But the deaths of the Navajo couple suggested that doctors were not dealing with random individual tragedies. Something larger was happening. Somewhere in the Four Corners region, an unknown disease was moving silently through communities, and no one really understood how it spread, or where it came from, or how many more people might already be infected.
As more patients appeared across the Four Corners region, confusion began turning into fear. Doctors were seeing a pattern of severe respiratory illness, but none of the usual explanations fit. Tests for the flu came back negative. Pneumonia did not fully match the symptoms or the speed of deterioration. Plague, which has been historically tied to rodent populations in the American Southwest, was considered and ruled out. Bacterial infections failed to explain why otherwise healthy young adults were collapsing so quickly. And every answer seemed to lead nowhere. That uncertainty spread through hospitals almost as fast as the illness itself.
Emergency rooms, well, they fill with tensions as doctors watched patients struggle to breathe without understanding why it was happening. Nurses and respiratory specialists worked frantically to stabilize people whose oxygen levels just kept crashing despite the aggressive treatment. Families sat in the waiting rooms desperate for explanations that, well, doctors could not yet provide. Some patients deteriorated so rapidly that relatives barely had time to understand the seriousness of the illness before intensive care became necessary. And outside the hospitals, rumors rushed in to fill the vacuum left by the uncertainty, as it normally does.
People began speculating about chemical spills, environmental poisoning, and industrial contamination. Some feared toxic waste exposure from nearby mining or military activity. Others wondered whether some kind of secret government experiment had gone wrong. They may not be altogether wrong, but here we are. Anyway, the idea of a bioweapon even surfaced in conversations and media reports. In isolated communities where information moved unevenly and fear spread quickly, almost every theory sounded possible. At this point, sounds possible to me.
Very possible, and still could be, you know.
Right.
Maybe not for this, but something else.
Indeed.
But part of that panic, well, it reflected the cultural atmosphere of early 1990s America. The Cold War had officially ended only a few years earlier, but the anxieties that were created, they still lingered. Americans spent decades living in fear of radiation, chemical exposure, hidden contamination, and secret government programs like Area 51. Aliens. I had to say it. Sorry. Public distrust surrounding environmental disasters and military secrecy remained strong. Events like Three Mile Island, Cold War nuclear testing, and toxic waste controversies had already shaped public imagination. When a mysterious illness suddenly appeared with no explanation, many people, well, they suspected something was hidden or man-made, or just a cover-up in general.
Nothing would shock me at this point.
No, and I know we're joking around. This is a very serious issue. We understand that. So,
The seriousness of the issue just not lost upon us.
yes.
The deeper problem was psychological, though. Human beings are uncomfortable with randomness, especially when death appears suddenly and without explanation. And that's deep rooted in the psyche in us humans.
We talked about that in an episode, something about numbers, where people don't like random. If it's random, this just it blows the mind. What was that? I can't remember. But anyway,
Was it the talking to yourself one?
no, no,
I don't remember.
I don't either. Anyway, we'll continue on. I'll try to look it up.
An identified danger can be prepared for. An unknown danger creates something worse, uncertainty. And uncertainty allows fear to grow in every direction all at once. That growing fear finally triggered a federal response.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, better known as the CDC, well, they sent epidemiologists into the Four Corners region to investigate the outbreak. And they're often called the disease detectives because their job, well, it kind of resembles criminal investigators, but they're kind of doing it with medicine, right? Instead of solving murders, they're trying to solve outbreaks. They search for patterns that are hidden inside the chaos.
The investigators began by interviewing families, friends, coworkers, and surviving patients. They mapped where victims lived, traveled, and worked. They examined homes, searched for shared exposures, and reconstructed timelines leading up to each illness. Every object, every location, every routine became a possible clue.
Benford's Law.
Benford's Law. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, that was the episode where we talked about randomness.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, the investigation was, well, it was frustrating and it was inconclusive. The victims did not appear connected by food, social gatherings, workplaces, or water sources. So there was no contaminated restaurant, no shared public event, no obvious chain of transmission. Some patients lived hundreds of miles apart from one another. Others had no known contact with one another at all. And that randomness made the mystery even more disturbing.
Diseases usually leave patterns. Foodborne outbreaks cluster around restaurants or products. Influenza spreads visibly through communities. Environmental poisonings tend to center around specific locations. But this illness seemed to strike without logic. Healthy people were dying in isolated towns across the Southwest, connected only by geography and symptoms.
As investigators dug deeper, that lack of clear connections became its own clue. The disease was not spreading through crowds or direct contact. Whatever was causing these deaths had to be something quieter, something already woven into the environment itself.
The investigation now shifted into its most methodical phase, identifying the cause through elimination. With no clear answer emerging from patient histories or geographic clustering, scientists began widening the net and testing every plausible environmental factor that could explain a sudden wave of severe respiratory illness.
They examined local water sources first, checking for contaminants that might explain shared exposure. When that yielded nothing consistent, attention moved to industrial chemicals and airborne pollutants. The Southwest had, well, it had pockets of mining activity and agricultural pesticide use, both of which can produce toxic exposure events and, if it's mismanaged. Those possibilities were carefully evaluated and rolled out as patterns that failed to match the distribution of the cases.
Researchers also investigated pesticides and rodent deterrents used in rural areas, as well as potential industrial contamination from nearby facilities. At the same time, virologists tested for known respiratory pathogens, including influenza strains and bacterial agents capable of causing pneumonia like symptoms. Every sample that came back negative narrowed the field further, but also deepened the uncertainty.
One of the core challenges was that early hantavirus infections, well, it looked deceptively ordinary. The initial symptoms, the fever, fatigue, muscle aches, headaches, well, they closely resemble flu and, common cold and other seasonal illnesses. By the time severe respiratory distress appears, the disease has already progressed rapidly, advanced stages. This overlap makes early detection extremely difficult, especially in rural settings where advanced diagnostic tools, well, they may not be immediately available. What became clear to investigators was a broader truth about outbreak science. Identifying a cause is often less about finding the answer directly and more about systematically eliminating everything else that it could be.
Now, the breakthrough came when epidemiologists began noticing a shared environmental detail among many of the victims. A significant number had recently been in close proximity to rural storage spaces, sheds, barns, cabins, garages, and outbuildings that had not been regularly cleaned or sealed. Many had been sweeping floors, moving old belongings, or reopening spaces that had been closed for long periods.
These environments were not unusual in themselves, right? In rural parts of the Southwest, rodent activity, well, it's common enough that it's often treated as a nuisance rather than a warning sign. And that common part of life, well, was really part of the danger. What seemed routine exposure was actually the key to the outbreak.
As investigators focused on these locations, they began trapping rodents across affected areas. The most frequently encountered species was the deer mouse, a small, brown rodent found widely through North America. And it's unremarkable in appearance and behavior, often living in fields, storage buildings, and rural structures without drawing attention.
But laboratory testing revealed something unexpected. A portion of these deer mice carried a previously unidentified virus belonging to the Hantavirus family, and this discovery marked a turning point in the investigation. The mystery was no longer purely environmental or chemical in nature, it was biological.
The focus of the outbreak immediately shifted from external contamination theories to zoonotic disease transmission. So, similar to the plague, but not the plague. Illnesses that move from animals to human. Further genetic analysis confirmed that the newly identified pathogen was a distinct hantavirus strain, previously unknown in North America, because it did not yet have a formal classification. It was initially referred to in reference to its origins in the Southwest and its unclear identity. Eventually, it was named Sin Nombre virus, Spanish for virus with no name. Factoid. Reflecting both its novelty and the uncertainty that surrounded it at the time of discovery.
Sin Nombre virus?
Mhm.
See, I don't have the Spanish
Well,
tongue.
well, okay, but we would say virus like that, but I think they would say virus because I's are pronounced like E's.
Hantavirus, well, you know, were not new to science. They had already been documented in parts of Asia and Europe where certain strands were known, well, to cause severe illness linked to rodent exposure. One of the earliest recognized hantaviruses was Hantavirus, and this was identified during and after the Korean War, when soldiers developed a serious hemorrhagic fever linked to field exposure. This established a broader family of viruses as rodent associated pathogens with, well, significant medical impact.
What the Four Corners outbreak revealed was that North America had its own endemic hantavirus species that had gone unrecognized until a major outbreak exposed it. The virus had not suddenly appeared. It had been present in rodent populations undetected until environmental conditions and human exposure aligned in a way that brought it into view. Hey, William, before we get on to the next section, what do you say we take a break?
You mean how the infection actually happens?
Yes.
Yeah. So now that we're back, as
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I came across Big Fork Brands recently, and it's become one of those finds you actually want to tell people about, and you don't find that often. Okay. They're doing bacon sausage, plus these really solid pork jerky snacks and Chicago style sauces. Basically, upgrade anything you throw them on burgers, hot dogs, fries, throw it on there. It works.
But I bet it's packed full of junk.
Actually, it's made with clean ingredients and real care. That's small batch with no shortcuts, and people are obsessed with the flavor. You can go over to bigforkbrands.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout, and get 20% off anything on the site.
You can find the link and our code in the show notes. Promise. How infection happens. So, once the virus was identified, the next critical question was how humans were actually becoming infected. And the answer revealed why the outbreak had been so difficult to trace. Transmission was invisible and indirect.
Hantavirus is primarily spread through infected rodent excretions, including urine, droppings, and saliva. In dry environments like the Southwest, these materials can quickly desiccate or break down, breaking down into fine particles that mix with dust. When a contaminated area is disturbed by sweeping, cleaning, or moving stored objects, these particles become airborne.
And humans are infected when they inhale that contaminated dust. The virus enters the respiratory system directly, reaching the lungs without any need for a bite or physical contact with the animal itself. This makes the exposure pathway especially deceptive because there is often no obvious moment of transmission.
Importantly, hantavirus in North America is not typically spread through casual human contact, and direct transmission between people is extremely rare for this strain. The danger is environmental, not interpersonal.
So, this is what made the outbreak so unsettling in hindsight. The most common activities, opening a long closed cabin, sweeping a floor, cleaning a shed, were precisely what triggered exposure. There was no dramatic encounter, no visible hazard, no clear warning. Instead, the transmission unfolded through a simple sequence that was easy to overlook. A broom against an old floor, dust rising in the air, in the still air at that, and all of those little microscopic particles, well, you're breathing them in and they're going straight to your lungs unnoticed.
Why did it happen? By the time scientists understood the virus itself, a deeper question emerged. Why did it appear in the first place? At this moment, with such intensity, the answer did not come from a lab alone, but from the environment surrounding the outbreak. One of the key drivers traced back to the large scale climate pattern known as El Nino, a periodic warming of the central and eastern Pacific Ocean. While it begins thousands of miles away in ocean currents, its effects ripple outward, reshaping weather systems across the globe. In the American Southwest, El Nino years can bring unusually heavy rainfall to regions that are typically dry and arid.
In a desert ecosystem or desert ecosystem, that shift is transformative.
I
Uh,
always want to read desert like dessert too.
yeah. But rain does not simply dampen the ground. It resets the entire biological system, right? Seeds that may have remained dormant for years suddenly germinate, like those tumbleweeds cat we're talking about. They're amazing. Vegetation spreads across landscapes that are usually, well, sparse. Food sources that are normally limited become abundant almost overnight.
And that abundance sets off an ecological chain reaction. More rain leads to more plant growth. More plants lead to more seeds. More seeds provide a surge in food for small mammals, particularly rodents like the deer mouse. With more food available, survival rates increase, reproduction accelerates, and populations expand rapidly.
So, cause and effect. And this is how a regional outbreak began to take shape long before any human case was identified. The environment itself had created ideal conditions for rodent population growth, which in turn increased the likelihood of human exposure to a virus already present within those rodent populations.
The key insight was unsettling in its simplicity. Nature had not created the virus for this moment, it had simply amplified the conditions that allowed it to surface. In this sense, the outbreak did not begin in 1993 hospitals. It began months earlier in shifting weather patterns over the Pacific Ocean.
So, as rainfall transformed the desert landscape, deer mice populations experienced a dramatic surge. Areas that once supported limited rodent activity, well, it suddenly became dense habitats. Fields filled with new vegetation became feeding grounds. Barns and sheds, well, they offered shelter. Homes and vehicles in rural areas became, well, unintended extension rodent territory.
So humans and rodents were cohabitating for months with storage buildings that had been untouched for months to years and were reopened. Agricultural structures were accessed more frequently. Normal routines. Rural households continued normal routines, often unaware that rodent populations around them had increased substantially.
And what makes this moment critical is that the virus itself likely did not originate in 1993. Hantavirus was already present in rodent populations long before the outbreak of 93. What changed was exposure. Environmental conditions had expanded the number of infected hosts, which increased the chances of humans encountering those contaminated environments. Because, as Kat said, the cohabitation, you really just didn't know it was there. It was just quietly lurking in the background, just waiting.
Once inside the human body, hantavirus infection follows a pattern that is deceptively similar at first, then rapidly devastating. The illness typically begins with flu-like phase, marked by fever, profound exhaustion, muscle aches, headaches, and sometimes gastrointestinal symptoms such as nausea. At this stage, there's often no clear indication that the disease will become life-threatening. But the progression can change quickly and dramatically.
In the pulmonary phase of the illness, the respiratory system begins to fail. Patients develop rapid breathing and severe shortness of breath. Oxygen levels in the blood drop sharply. The defining mechanism behind this deterioration is a condition known as capillary leak syndrome, in which the body's immune response, well, it damages the tiny blood vessels within the lungs.
As these capillaries become more permeable, fluid begins to leak into the air spaces of the lungs. This process leads to a condition known as non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Importantly, this is not caused by heart failure, drowning, or external fluid entering the lungs. Instead, it's the result of internal vascular damage triggered by the immune system's response to the virus.
So when we say the lungs are filling up with fluid, this is what we mean. As that fluid accumulates, the lungs become increasingly unable to exchange oxygen. So breathing becomes labored. It's not sufficient, right? The decline can be extremely rapid, with some patients moving from mild respiratory symptoms to critical illness within hours. And the emotional impact of this phase is severe because of how quickly it unfolds. Patients who were conscious and mobile earlier in the day, well, they can require intensive respiratory support by nightfall.
Despite advantages in modern medicine, there is still no specific antiviral cure for the hantavirus infection once it progresses to severe disease. Treatment is entirely supportive, focused on maintaining breathing and stabilizing the body while it attempts to fight the infection. Care typically includes supplemental oxygen, mechanical ventilation for patients who cannot breathe adequately on their own, and intensive care monitoring. In most severe cases, advanced life support technologies such as ECMO or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation may be used to oxygenate blood outside the body while the lungs recover.
Even with aggressive medical intervention, hantavirus remains highly dangerous. In documented U.S. cases, the mortality rate has historically ranged around 35 to 40%, making it one of the most severe naturally occurring viral respiratory syndromes.
The danger is not only in the severity of the illness, but in its speed. By the time patients reach the most critical stage, significant lung damage has often already occurred, leaving a narrow window for effective intervention.
This reality underscores a difficult truth in medicine. Even with modern technology and intensive care, there are still diseases that progress faster than treatment can fully respond. The emotional weight of hantavirus lies in And that imbalance between how ordinary the exposure can be and how rapidly the body can fail once this infection takes hold.
Once the Four Corners outbreak was understood, its impact extended far beyond the patients it affected. It became a turning point for how public health agencies approached rodent borne diseases and rural environmental exposure.
In the years that followed, surveillance systems for rodent populations they were strengthened in regions where hantavirus were known to circulate. Scientists and public health officials began monitoring deer mice activity more systematically, tracking population changes that could signal increased risk. Outbreak detection methods also improved, with faster coordination between local hospitals, state health departments, and federal agencies like the CDC. When unusual clusters of respiratory illness appeared.
Another major shift occurred in rural disease awareness. The outbreak highlighted how environmental exposure risks can be overlooked in less densely populated areas, where routine interaction with sheds, barns, and storage spaces is part of everyday life. Public health messaging increasingly focused on these environments, treating them not as background spaces, but as potential points of exposure.
The CDC has also developed and expanded public education campaigns aimed to prevent rather than react. These warnings, they emphasize practical steps that can and should reduce risk during cleanup or renovation activities in rodent-prone areas. They're advised to avoid sweeping dry rodent droppings, to ventilate enclosed spaces before entering or cleaning, to use disinfectants to wet down contaminated areas first, and to wear protective equipment when handling potentially infected materials. The goal was simple: reduce airborne particles before they can be inhaled.
At a broader level, the outbreak reinforced a key principle in public health. Systems often evolve in response to failure. Large scale health crises frequently become the catalyst for new standards, new awareness, and improved prevention strategies that did not exist before the crisis occurred.
And today, hantavirus remains rare, but it has not disappeared. Instead, it exists as a persistent low-level risk in, certain ecological regions where rodents host are present.
In the United States, most cases continue to occur in the western states, particularly in rural or semi rural environments where deer mice are common. Similar hantavirus related illness also appear in parts of Canada and across sections of Central and South America where different rodent species carry related viral strains.
Globally, hantaviruses are not a single disease, but a family of viruses, each adapted to different rodent host and geographic regions. Some cause hemorrhagic fever syndromes, while others, like the North American strain responsible for Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome, they primarily affect the respiratory system.
One important clarification that remains critical in public health messaging is that human to human transmission is extremely rare for the North American hantavirus strains associated with the 1993 outbreak. Most infections occur through environmental exposure to contaminated rodent material rather than through contact between infected individuals.
And even today, occasional cases still occur that are most often associated with people who spend time in rural or semi rural settings, campers, reopening seasonal shelters, homeowners cleaning long unused buildings, agricultural workers, hikers, or individuals exposed to rodent infested storage spaces. The pattern has remained consistent over time. The risk is not in daily urban life, but in certain environmental infections where rodent activity goes unnoticed.
Part of what makes the hantavirus so unsettling is not only its biological impact, but the way it challenges human perception of danger. The threat does not present itself as an obvious or dramatic form. There are no visible predators, no immediate sensory warning, and no clear moment of contact. So exposure can occur in environments that feel entirely ordinary.
And this creates a unique psychological tension, right? People tend to fear dangers they can see or easily imagine. Sharks in the ocean, plane crashes in the sky, or snakes on a plane, which is a really bad movie. Violent crimes carried out by unidentified individuals. These risks are emotionally vivid, even if they are rare.
By contrast, hantavirus belongs to a different category of risk, one that is invisible, environmental, and delayed in effects. It does not announce itself. It exists in dust, in closed spaces, in routine cleaning tasks, and because it does not fit into similar mental models of danger, it's harder for people to intuitively assess.
So, this mismatch between perception and reality is part of what makes microscopic threats so difficult to emotionally process. The human mind is not naturally equipped to track risks that are invisible, delayed, or dependent on certain environmental conditions. As a result, the most strategically significant dangers are not always the ones that feel the most urgent.
The story ultimately circles back to where it began an ordinary, forgotten space, a shed, a hunting cabin sealed through the winter, a garage filled with old tools and unopened boxes. These are not places that feel dangerous. They're quiet, familiar, often ignored, definitely covered in years of dust. You probably should have done this years ago.
I'm not cleaning it now.
And yet, they become the setting for something invisible to take shape.
Inside these spaces, dust hangs in the air when disturbed. Sunlight cuts through the cracks in the wood, and you can see the dust particles kind of floating around. It's a surface that needs to be cleaned after years of neglect. Nothing,
With a respirator.
yeah, absolutely. Or kind of wet it down a little bit, if you can, to kind of settle it before you get in there because, you know, the dangers is it may be there. It's just unseen, hanging in that dust-filled air.
Just pressure wash it.
There you go. Pressure wash everything, like the stains of my life.
Gone.
I mean, what did you think? I mean,
I liked it. It was very informative.
okay.
Very, very much needed, I think, at this point. I think at the very least to spread awareness about cleaning your shed after it's been sitting for a while.
It definitely opened my eyes, as somebody who leaves a place for a couple of months to go back to it, kind
Yeah,
of sets the stage for that too, for sure.
right. I'm never cleaning a shed again without a mask of some kind.
I get it that it's in the four corners, but the way the world works these days, you just
Yes,
never know.
indeed.
I feel
So
like we're all puppets in the puppet master's game.
I'm ready to cut some strings. In any
True.
case,
It's aliens.
it's aliens. Ooh.
I know we joked a lot through this episode, but this is a very serious issue. We didn't take anything lightly. We know that there's people that, are suffering, people that have, but at the same time, we have to be entertaining.
Yes, yes. There is a level of job to do here to at least make it entertaining for you to learn about something you may not even think about.
Absolutely.
If you would like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
Let's keep moving before I stick my foot in my mouth. If you would like to support this show, you can do so at Patreon or take advantage of our sponsors. Either way it goes, you can find those links in the show notes.
As always, William and I want to thank you for listening.
From day one to now, thank you.
You can join the Facebook group at Info on the Go
Over there, just share with us your show ideas or get to know Kat and myself.
or ask us a question.
But whatever you do, hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Send us some fan mail using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
And leaving that review really does help others find us. You can also email Kat or myself directly at,
Info on the Go podcast at gmail.com.
and all of that is in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.
If your stomach's been off lately, like bloating, reflux, or just not feeling right, there's a simpler way to get back on track.
With Professor B's Digestive Aid, which is an all natural blend of pure honey and ancient apitherapy, a herb rooted in Roman tradition. You know how at least they had some things right, right? It's designed to gently support and balance your digestion.
No long ingredient list, no harsh additives, just two powerful time-tested ingredients working together. It's even the same formula used to help cancer patients manage digestive discomfort.
And right now, you can get an exclusive 10% off any product. Just use our code INFOGO at checkout.